Hello, everybody. Thank you again for joining the inaugural UCA Town Hall hosted by United Chinese Americans. This is the first webinar in the series that will allow us to spotlight on various priority and important topics that are relevant to not just the Chinese American community, but for all our stakeholders, our friends and allies, and for those that are deeply impacted by the issues that we experience and face every day. So this is a great forum that we look forward to engaging not only with speakers and experts from our community, but also hopefully with your input and your feedback. So we look forward to hearing from you. And at the very end of the seminar, we also hope that you will have an opportunity to ask questions, engage with our experts, and please feel free to ping us, whether it is during the seminar or afterwards via email or however you want to reach out to our team. And we look forward to your ideas and feedback on how we can make this a forum that's dedicated to you and to serve your needs. So again, my name is Monica, and I am going to be the moderator tonight. Without further ado, if I may please introduce Mr. Haipei Shue. He is the president of UCA, and he is going to kick us off by talking a little more about what we're doing today and what we hope to accomplish.
Hi, my name is Haipei Shue. I'm president of the United Chinese Americans. Welcome for this lecture, whether you are in China or in the West Coast or in the East Coast. We're going to have a very engaging and a very rare opportunity to learn as much as we can from our three top senior lawyers from Jones Day Law Firm. This is impossible without the three of them. To spend their own time for us on this evening. Now, and of course, thanks so much for Monica for putting this together. Now, Monica is our senior advisor for government affairs. She was a director in the previous administration in the White House in charge of China trade. So if you have any complaint about China trade, you can go to Monica. Now, quickly, what is this UCA? Some of you may not know about United Chinese Americans. Very quickly, we have been there for 3.5 or 4 years. This is mostly made of the new immigrant community, a nationwide civic organization for our community's civic engagement and political participation. Now, we are a national coalition with about 10 chapters, 25 community partners, and many individual members across the country. This seminar, we have intended this seminar to be regularly held, focused on major national policy issues. So, and this is the inaugural ones. And we're very fortunate to have the three distinguished lawyers with us today. Now, as you know, we're going to talk about the presidential executive orders regarding TikTok and WeChat. United Chinese American has taken a position on that. We have an open letter addressed to the White House shared during this webinar. We will send it out again to whoever has attended this meeting today with the Zoom recording if we have no technical problem with that. So this webinar will be about major issues and national policies, politics concerning our community, whether that's civil rights issues or immigration issues or US-China relation issues or trade issues, whatever that has a direct impact on our community. That two executive order already has had pretty adverse impact among the Chinese American community, and even to some extent caused a lot of uncertainty and even panic. And we are going to let our lawyers to give us a very authoritative and comprehensive take on that. And this evening, it is impossible also without the help of Stephen Pei, Professor Pei in Houston, is our founding chairman of the board, and Xiao Ma from San Francisco. She's our chair of our membership and donation committee. I'll let this, without further ado, let our lawyers take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Haipei. And again, thank you for your leadership and your dedication to UCA and the Chinese American community. So let me quickly introduce our three speakers for today. And as we've sent out their bios and the email, and also it's on our website at UCA. So feel free to look that up. But I do want to say a few words, especially for our first speaker, Mr. Brian Sun. It's not every day where you get to meet a gentleman who has his own Wikipedia page. But Brian is well known to be one of the top lawyers in the United States, one of the most influential attorneys in California. But not only that, but he has also been a dedicated visionary as well as a leader for our community, for the Chinese American community. And his work has served justice and protected the lives of countless Americans. One of those Americans being Dr. Wen-Ho Lee. We also have with us today, Laura Fraedrich at Jones Day. Brian is also with Jones Day, as Haipei had noted. Laura has more than 20 years of experience serving companies and helping them comply and understand these various complex and always changing government regulations, particularly in regarding to international trade, investment, and export policies. Joining her today is Mr. Justin Huff. Justin joined Jones Day from having been served as an official in the Treasury Department, working on CFIUS, which will come up quite often today. It's the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States. So he's had a front row seat on how Treasury Department and the US government has been implementing and establishing the rules and policies for that very important regulatory framework, which we will hear more about today. So now let me turn it over to Brian, who's going to begin the presentation by giving us a little more framing of what is happening and why are we here today.
Great. Thank you, Monica. And I want to thank UCA, Haipei, Monica, for organizing this webinar, which I think is both timely, important, and unfortunately will be probably one of many that we're going to have to do in the coming months and maybe even years. Some of you may have already seen me talk before and sort of know about some of the things I've said, but tonight we're going to really be focusing on something that touches just about everybody, which is WeChat, TikTok, the executive orders recently coming out of the administration, and things that are very topical. One might even call it breaking news. But, you know, these days, everything is breaking news. Every day there's something new. Particularly, you almost can't go on the news without hearing China being connected to some topic on the news, either involving trade, national security, bashing between the countries on different subjects. And that's why I'm pleased to have my colleagues Laura and Justin on this webinar, because they're really going to hit on something very topical and very important to everybody. But for my purposes here, I'm not here to sort of rewind and say many of the things that some of you have already heard me talk about in other contexts or other seminars, but I do think it is important to put some of what we're going to be talking about in context. We all know that there is this overlay about national security, what I call the loyalty issue, that overlays all of this, as well as some of the historical issues that have come up since, you know, the late 1940s and early 50s, when China went to a communist party regime, and where our community here in the United States was subjected in the 50s to a lot of the same kind of things we're seeing today. And so for many of you that have heard me do the history repeats itself mantra, we're going through one of those cycles as we speak. And a lot of it is the same stuff. Issues relating to whether or not Chinese Americans are loyal to the United States versus the homeland or motherland or whatever the government likes to call it in their papers sometimes. So you have the loyalty overlay. And then you have this national security element that goes along with it, which is that China is a national security threat to the interests of the United States. And in the 50s, there was that concern because of communism. And now as we enter into this era here, with China's emergence in the 1980s, or you would argue in my generation, in a single generation, emerged from, you know, some might say, as Napoleon said, a sleeping giant to a global superpower with as an economic and technological rival to the United States. We all know this, but this is the context in which this seminar comes up or webinar comes up, because national security, as I've said in many of my talks that many of you heard, national security trumps due process, civil rights. We've seen that in the United States historically with the Japanese American experience with the relocation camps in the 40s. And to this day, we see the same thing, where whether you would call it paranoia and overreaction, or some sincerely based perceptions that China is a national security threat to the United States, we, our community, the Chinese American community, has and will continue to suffer when that kind of situation continues. And as I've said in many of the talks here, that, you know, for those of you who are holding out for the election to change things, don't expect that the election or perhaps the ushering in of a new administration to really change the dynamics that we're dealing with. Many of you know that some of the cases involving some Chinese Americans like Sherry Chen and Professor Shaoxing Shi at Temple, who were investigated and prosecuted by the government and were exonerated. Those investigations took place under Democratic attorney generals and under Democratic presidents. So don't think things are just going to change just because an election might happen in the next 75 days. Our work is going to have to continue. We're going to have to think strategically about how we educate and approach any, hopefully, new policymakers, both in Congress and in the executive branch, on how they should view China, how they should view Chinese Americans, how they should view due process, civil rights, and racial profiling, and things like that. Now, in the short time that I have, because I really do want to give Justin and Laura the platform here, many of you know about the China Initiative, and you've heard me talk about it, and some of you or many of you have either read about it or have heard me talk about it in other webinars. But in late 2018, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions ushered in something called the China Initiative, where the DOJ, the US Department of Justice, pretty much announced that one of their strategic priorities in law enforcement was to battle what they perceived, the US government and the DOJ perceived to be a systemic state-sponsored, state being Chinese government, theft of US technology. Now, those of you who remember the Wen-Ho Lee case will recall that that was a case that involved actually, arguably, nuclear weapons technology and those sorts of things that actually involved, you might say, traditional national security interests. But over the last 20 years since Wen-Ho's case, and it's been almost 20 years since he was released from custody, September of 2000, the government's concern has morphed beyond traditional weaponry type national security or espionage, and has morphed into all areas of modern technology, whether it be pharmaceutical, big pharma drug, cancer drug research, bio-life science stuff, to other sorts of things that you would not normally think would be covered by national security concerns. And the DOJ's China Initiative and it's pretty much something that you can look at there on the internet. I'll summarize it for you. Is focused a lot on the transfer of technology from the US to China, and the perception that China, through its 1,000 talent plans and programs and other sorts of research endeavors, is looking to recruit Chinese Americans in particular to come back to China, live permanently, research in labs that are set up, and lend their know-how and give their know-how to China through various programs, some of which involve financial inducements. And that has led to, through this China initiative, a substantial effort by the Department of Justice and its 94 US attorneys' offices spread throughout the country to have a substantial amount of resources devoted towards identifying leading scientists, researchers, academics, and many of our top institutions to see if they have ties with China and some of these programs designed to arguably exchange know-how and research and technology for the greater good of the world. But the US government and the DOJ's focus is, of course, on transfer of technology from on sensitive areas of research to Chinese institutions, and with less emphasis or desire to have these academics and researchers work together for the greater good of the world. And so, again, this is where national security is trumping developing technology. We know that the cutting edges of technology here are in such areas as artificial intelligence, drone technology, all these different things that are going to change the way in which we all live and the world that we will live in for ourselves and for our kids, pretty much. And the DOJ China initiative, while it is focusing on a whole bunch of different prosecution type concerns, pretty much is focusing on our academics and researchers. And so it's not a surprise for you to see that there's a growing proliferation of investigations and prosecutions of some of our top Chinese American scientists and researchers, and it's stuff you're going to see on the news. And there was a arrest just last Sunday night of a Texas A&M professor. I can tell you there were cases, and you could go to the Department of Justice website to see that they are doing cases involving people at Harvard, MIT, Stanford, Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas, West Virginia, a whole slew of institutions where those institutions have developed relationships with Chinese research institutions. And, you know, until more recently, this was encouraged. This was for the greater good of research and development for both countries. But now the atmosphere and the context has changed, and the Chinese American professors who were encouraged to develop these relationships in China are now under scrutiny and investigation for their ties to China, and resulting in prosecutions. Now, I will say before I turn this over to Justin and Laura, because I could go on about these matters for a lot more, but that's really not what we're here to talk about tonight. We're here to talk about WeChat and some of the other things going on in the US-China rubric, is the fact that, you know, our message has been to the professors and academics, and, you know, some of you have heard me say, don't be stupid. Well, I've changed the mantra to be smarter, because many of these academics, when they are filling out their conflict of interest forms or making disclosures about their China ties, are not actually doing so very effectively or accurately, and that's what exposes them to investigation and possible prosecution. So we are making every effort, UCA and other groups, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Committee of 100, OCA, the coalition of groups, is making an effort to try to help these academics and professors try to not step on the landmine in the minefield they already find themselves in because of the DOJ China initiative. And the other thing we are doing, UCA and other groups, is we are trying to work with the Department of Justice in educating these academics, and at the same time, really urging the DOJ to do these cases in a way where, look, go after the bad guys, that's okay. But, you know, you're not gonna find very many cases, and we haven't found really hardly any yet, where any of these professors who are being investigated and prosecuted have actually given any technology that's been compromised in any way to their Chinese partners or counterparts. And this is where the disconnect begins, where the DOJ is criminalizing what might be traditionally an employment matter between the university and the professor and turning it into a crime and depriving the United States, arguably, of some very good technological know-how when these professors are maybe forced to go back to China because the Americans are saying, we don't want you, which is contrary to the whole notion of what the China initiative should be all about, which is to keep all this good know-how here in the United States. So look, we need to get organized. We need to get our voices heard. We need to be strategic about it. We need to expect that even if there is a possible change of administration in November, that there's this challenge of educating and working together with the government and speaking up has to continue and be well thought of. And you who are participants in this seminar need to be part of that. As many of you heard me say, you can't expect others to just step up and do it. We got to get organized, form coalitions with even non-Chinese American professional organizations. If we're going to be effective in educating the Congress and any new administration about some of the issues involving what we're doing, and particularly on the loyalty issue. So again, I need to cut short here and turn this over to Laura and Justin to really talk about what we're here to talk about tonight, which is one of the iterations of this fallout from the China initiative, which is the recent executive orders regarding WeChat and TikTok. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleagues, Laura and Justin. And again, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this subject, because we need to work together and not just educate, but we need to speak up and advance our cause, that we're not going to be taking some of these shots in the media or through Twitter and all these different things, and where they're attacking Chinese Americans and our loyalty, because we cannot and should not take this line down. So thank you again, Monica and Haipei, for the opportunity to chat, and I'm going to turn it over to Laura and Justin at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And again, you know, the WeChat and the TikTok EO is not going to be the first case that we're facing, and it's not going to be the last, as Brian just said. So thank you very much for laying that foundation. And so now we welcome our next two speakers, Laura Fraedrich and Justin Huff. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Monica. Thanks, Brian, for setting the stage there. It's a very useful segue into what I wanted to talk about, which is a little bit of background about CFIUS, which Monica mentioned in her opening remarks, and sort of how did we get here to the place that Brian mentioned, where data issues and some new things that we didn't previously consider from a national security perspective have become part of the national security analysis. And specifically, as part of the China initiative, one of his bullet points was this FIRMA. FIRMA stands for the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. And it is an update of the CFIUS authorities and CFIUS law that occurred in August of 2018. But before we jump into FIRMA, I just want to set a little bit of background for those of you who may not be really familiar with CFIUS. So CFIUS stands for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and it has the authority to review transactions where a foreign buyer is going to acquire some sort of interest in a U.S. business if that raises national security concerns. Historically, this committee exists because there's a law that allows the President of the United States to require a foreign buyer to divest itself of an investment it might make in a U.S. business if there are national security interests. So foreign buyers and the U.S. businesses can go to this committee. It's an interagency committee made up of agencies like Homeland Security and Department of State and Department of Justice and Department of Defense, the various types of U.S. agencies that you would expect to look at national security issues. And the parties to the transaction can go there to the committee and try to get the transaction cleared. They explain who the buyer is and what the U.S. business and why there are no national security concerns. So this process has been around for quite some time, but after 2015 or so, I think the U.S. government felt that the existing law and regulation wasn't sufficient to protect national security issues that were evolving. And think about this in terms of the technology aspect here. One of the things that's very different is we have smartphones now, we have smart cars now, we have smart houses now. So there's a lot more data that is being gathered about U.S. citizens through some of the U.S. businesses. And so CFIUS and the U.S. government has been concerned about this data from a national security perspective. And part of that is what led to the passing of this new law in 2018. And by the way, as Brian mentioned, this will not go away if there is a new administration coming in. This passage of this law was very bipartisan. It was something like 98-2 in the Senate, to give you an idea. So this is not just a Republican initiative. It's not just a President Trump initiative. This is a very bipartisan new law. And so part of the new law, for one thing, it makes some filings mandatory, which is significant because before it was always voluntary. And it also created new categories of certain types of businesses that are quite sensitive. And those are what we have here on the slide, the TID US businesses. So technology is the T, infrastructure is the I, and data is the D. And it's the data issues that are really underlying these executive orders related to WeChat and TikTok. So the US government is very concerned about the ability of foreign countries or foreign governments to have significant amounts of data about US citizens. And it can be financial data, it can be health data, it can be geolocation data. I have a couple of examples here on the slide of things that were of great concern to the US government. You might have read about the OPM data breach that occurred back in 2014, where they reported at least that Chinese interests were able to hack into the Office of Personnel Management and get a lot of data about US government workers. You may have read about some concerns related to fitness apps that servicemen were using on military bases, allowed foreign countries or governments to know where those servicemen were exercising. That was a concern. And this Patients Like Me item was a situation where there was this platform called Patients Like Me, a website that allowed individual citizens to put information on there about their health situation and treatments they were getting, to share information among each other so that they could know what treatments were working. Well, a Chinese entity had bought an interest in Patients Like Me, and the US government, the president required them to divest that interest because of the concern about that healthcare data. Similarly, there was a situation where a Chinese entity bought an interest in a hotel reservation management service. And the US government similarly required them to sell that. So The concern is about data. Where are people? How can that data be potentially used nefariously? That's the concern of the US government that has led to the 2 executive orders here. Now, the CFIUS authorities only kick in where there is an investment by a foreign entity in a US business. So that happened with TikTok, and Justin's going to talk to you a little bit about that, how one of the executive orders relates to CFIUS authorities. But in the issue of WeChat and the other executive order about TikTok, there was not an acquisition. And so the US government, the president used his authority under IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And that is the underlying authority for our economic sanctions laws. For example, you can't trade with Iran, you can't trade with North Korea. So it's very unusual for it to be used this way to declare that there's a national emergency because of national security reasons that requires a prohibition on transactions with those 2 entities. So that's a very unusual use, but we also have the overlapping CFIUS authorities related to TikTok. So I'm going to turn it over to Justin and let him explain to you the executive orders, what they do, what the dates are, and so on. And then we'll talk about what could happen next.
Thanks, Laura. So as Laura mentioned, there's a lot of different areas in which the United States government is concerned with, and most recently, and in some of the examples we've been talking about this evening, as she noted, data is one of those primary areas. Even with the passage of FIRMA and the additional authorities provided to CFIUS, the federal government recognizes that CFIUS is just one vehicle to address national security concerns related to cross-border investments and transactions. The federal government continues to use a variety of authorities that it views as necessary to protect the United States national security. This started back, and I'm going to share 4 examples right now. The first one is actually back in May of 2019. The administration issued an executive order on securing the Information and Communications Technology and Services, or ICTS, supply chain. This executive authority authorizes the Commerce Secretary to regulate the acquisition and use of ICTS from a foreign adversary. The executive order maintains that this measure is necessary because, quote, foreign adversaries are increasingly creating and exploiting vulnerabilities in ICTS in order to commit malicious cyber-enabled actions, including economic and industrial espionage. In draft regulations that will implement the ICTS order, the Commerce Department notes that it intends to adopt a case-by-case, fact-specific approach to determine which transactions meet the requirements set forth in the executive order, and therefore will be prohibited or must be mitigated. As Laura noted, earlier this month, the president issued 2 executive orders related to WeChat and TikTok, using the presidential IEPA authorities. These orders will soon prohibit transactions between the owners of these applications with persons in the United States or subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. The orders also instruct the Commerce Department to define what transactions will be prohibited by September 20th. For those of us who follow CFIUS on a regular basis, we are very surprised to see the executive order related to TikTok. Although filings with CFIUS are confidential, there was a lot of public discussion and press that suggests that the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States was reviewing the TikTok transaction. We've learned over the past couple of weeks that that was in fact true, and that the United States government started reviewing that transaction officially in June of this year. Many of us were surprised because we expected that the government would rely on the CFIUS authorities to mitigate any national security concerns that might be identified. So when the government also issued an order on TikTok under its IEPA authorities, I think most of us were confused as to the direction that the government was headed. However, the following week, the president issued an order utilizing its CFIUS authorities to direct ByteDance, the owner of TikTok, to divest its ownership interest in the application. As I noted, public documents have suggested they began in June to review this transaction. Normally, CFIUS takes 90 days before referring a matter to the president for action. However, CFIUS deviated from this normal practice and did not utilize the full time allocated under the regulations to review the transaction. Oops, and I'm going to turn the time back to Laura.
So what's going to happen next? As Justin mentioned, the TikTok and WeChat executive orders under IEEPA requires Commerce to take action within 45 days, by September 20th. And what they're supposed to do is to tell us which activities will be prohibited. They're supposed to define which activities will no longer be allowed to occur. And these are activities that would occur by either US persons, wherever they're located in the world, or anybody when they're in the United States. And this is typical IEEPA language. That's how the US economic sanctions work. They apply to US persons wherever they are in the world and to anybody who's in the United States. So we don't know exactly what will happen. The executive orders talk about prohibiting transactions, but IEEPA does not define what a transaction is. So we are in sort of a wait and see mode here. It is possible that the United States government would say that no US person or anybody who's present in the United States can use these platforms in the future. Now, I suspect it's likely that this will not happen by September 20th. Indeed, for the first order that Justin was telling you about, they were supposed to promulgate regulations within 150 days, and they missed that. They issued draft regulations, but nothing has been formalized yet. And indeed, that might be why we got the second TikTok order, the divestiture order, because maybe they realize they're really not going to be able to figure out what will be prohibited. And for TikTok, at least, it'll just be easier since they have the CFIUS authority, because there was a transaction they could review to require ByteDance to sell TikTok. So we're sort of in a wait and see order there. TikTok has 90 days to comply with that divestiture order, which is a little bit longer than the September 20th deadline, of course, but I suspect it's going to be months before we know exactly what the rules will be under these executive orders. Justin, you want to go to the next slide? In the meantime, we have lawsuits. TikTok has sued in California Federal District Court, claiming lack of due process and that the decision was political and not related to national security. There are other arguments in that litigation, in that complaint also, that the president, or that IEEPA even goes beyond what the president should have allowed as his delegation authority. And also that the IEEPA does not allow the president to restrict the use of personal communications. I actually think that's a fairly strong argument. That's in both TikTok, the TikTok lawsuit, and the WeChat lawsuit. The WeChat lawsuit is by a coalition of WeChat users, not by WeChat itself, but they're claiming First Amendment rights and also not having IEEPA being limited such that it should not be allowed to restrict personal communications. Now, against those potentially good arguments, the issue is that courts often will not look past national security decisions. So it'll be very difficult. It'll be interesting to see if the courts will look at all or just accept on its merits the arguments by the administration that there are national security issues here that need to be addressed related to the data that is gathered through the TikTok process and through the WeChat process. So We don't know exactly what's going to happen. It'll be interesting to watch this litigation and see what happens. And also to see if the Commerce Department actually tells us by September 20th what will be prohibited. But it's possible that there could be a prohibition against US persons and anybody in the United States from using these two platforms, with potential civil and criminal penalties as currently exist under IEEPA for economic sanctions rules and economic sanctions violations. And with that, I'll turn it back to Monica.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Justin. Thank you very much for your in-depth presentation that looks more at the executive orders. What do they mean and what are the implications? I want to take a quick poll of our experts, because, you know, I'm hearing on one side, national security trumps all, right? That the presidential powers under IEEPA is quite broad and great, and the courts might not likely to challenge or, you know, or say otherwise. But I'm also hearing from Laura, Yor, and Justin's presentation that there are legitimate concerns and legitimate arguments against the approach through which the administration is attacking this issue, right? So never mind whether, so let's look at, you know, how likely, or do you think the Trump administration is going to succeed, and in this case, banning WeChat? And I think TikTok might have a little bit of a longer runway, but would welcome your thoughts on this too. Maybe we start with Brian. You know, thumbs up, thumbs down. Where do you think we're going to end up maybe in the next 100 days?
Well, you know, I am not an expert on this. I do have some interest when I follow U.S.-China trade relations and negotiations on trade policies and the back and forth regarding the current negotiations between the two governments on trade, and whether TikTok and WeChat and some of these other things are just things that are not noise, but certainly things made by the administration to send messages during the process of those negotiations, which again, from my standpoint, are very important to the current administration and for the United States, these discussions regarding everything from tariffs to all sorts of things. So maybe there's an element of that to this noise or distraction designed to help advantage U.S. negotiations in that sector. That's one possibility. There is, of course, the election rhetoric, for which we all know we have plenty of other sorts of China-related things that have come up. But a lot of it, a predominant theme is China stealing technology or being a threat to the United States in some way. And then there's this element of, you might say, for those who are political pundits, the bashing that has gone on the last 4 years that has been consistent when convenient for the current president to do it, to appeal to his political base as the election approaches, and but that he pragmatically may not follow through on some of these things, but it's, again, moves and noise that he does to try to appeal to his base. There's all those different threads or elements out there that I see, Monica, in play here. Again, it's hard to tell and predict, but going back to what Laura and Justin said, whether it's deadlines that are set by regs that they're going to let pass by and just ignore, or they're going to make some noise like they did about a month ago when the administration said, okay, we're going to revoke all the visas of all the international students if they don't go to class in person. That created a lot of noise. University sued. First hearing, the government withdrew its position and withdrew its rule. So you have a lot of this stuff, and that impacted our community in some way, because a third of those students, or a good number of the million international students, were from China. And many of the people on this call followed the same path of these international students. They came from China, they come here, they study, get post-grad things, they stay in the US and work and thrive here. But again, it goes back to this whole thing where you get these distractions. there's a lot of press, then it goes away, then the next one comes along. TikTok and WeChat may fall into that rubric as we get into the final 75 or 80 days towards the election, who knows? But as Laura and Justin said, it's forcing people to file lawsuits, it's forcing people to pay attention to the September 20th deadline, so you can't ignore them.
Absolutely. And given how, how popular and how prolific these and how important some of these platforms are, regardless of the critique, right, and the concerns, these decisions are going to have a fundamental impact on not just our lives, but many, many children who just want to make music videos. So turning to Laura next. Laura, I'd like to get your thoughts too. What do you think? Do you think the administration will be, will we end up with a ban? And what do you think might happen?
I think there's a better than likely chance that there will be a ban, that there will be some significant restriction on transactions by U.S. persons or persons in the United States. I don't know how long it'll take. I don't think they're going to hit the September 20th deadline. But I've been practicing international trade law for a long time, and I remember when President Trump was running for office and talking about the laws that he was going to use. And at that time, I thought, oh no, this Section 301 related to the use of, or the concerns about Chinese misappropriating technology and leading to all these tariffs. I never thought that would happen. I never thought the steel and aluminum tariffs would happen. So I think with the FIRMA being so bipartisan and with the concern about data and the type of data that is collected through these platforms, I do think there will likely be a ban. Whether a new administration comes in and then reverses things, I think there's some possibility that could happen. I mean, one thing I'll say that in the years that IEPA has been in effect since 1977 when it was passed, there have been some 60-some national emergencies declared, and Congress has never stepped in to undo any of those. So I think that, it's likely that this is going to go forward and something's going to come out of this.
And Justin, your thoughts on this?
I tend to agree with Laura. I think though, Americans are they're always looking for the opportunity to fill those voids. And so I think with TikTok, we've already seen a number of companies at least express interest in purchasing TikTok. And so some version of TikTok will endure. And I would expect that there are people who are currently evaluating, WeChat and saying if it is forced to be separated from its current ownership, is there someone who can step in and keep that platform alive? Because there's value in these things, right? And whether they're, and so I think it may take some time for these things to work themselves out. But like Laura said, I think be very difficult for the administration to step back from these without some significant changes or concessions by the owners today.
And so I think then the next question, right? If hypothetically, if there is a ban sometime in the next 100 days, or whether there's a divestment or some kind of a purchase, could mean that the platform could still live on, right? But I think what I'm hearing is there's also a possibility that if the divestment does not go through and the administration does not extend that deadline, that potentially there is consideration of maybe folks may be prohibited from using some of these platforms, or there might even be penalties, as Laura had mentioned in her presentation. Can you help us understand, in some of the more worst likely scenarios, again, these are scenarios, we all can't predict the future or else I'd be very rich right now, but hypothetically, for us to think about the future, if there is a ban for WeChat in particular, for many of us, that's the only way we are able to communicate with friends and colleagues in China. What are some of the penalties that could potentially be there for individuals if they use WeChat, either if they're in China or if they're using a smartphone that already has the application? So can you help us think things through, help us understand what are the implications, or do we just have to one day all of a sudden uninstall everything and then just kind of figure out next steps? Like, can you help us understand what are the liabilities and the risks? Maybe I'll
Yeah.
I know, Laura, you the one who kind of brought up the penalties. Maybe I can ask you
Yeah.
first. But I'm happy to have the other speakers address that as well.
Sure. Under IEPA, the civil penalties as a maximum, it's been being adjusted for inflation here and there, but the maximum civil penalty per transaction under IEPA right now is around $300,000. So whether there would be enforcement of individuals, I think, is another question altogether. I mean, I think it would be difficult. I mean, for example, we've had the Cuba embargo on for since the early 60s. What is that? What are we going on 60 years now? US citizens have not been able to travel to Cuba. There has been very little enforcement of that over the years. And sometimes if there is such a blatant case where somebody is publicizing, I think it was in the news, Beyonce and Jay-Z went to Cuba. And so there was a bunch of discussion about whether they were going to get an enforcement action. Those enforcement actions have been in the neighborhood of penalties of around $5,000. So there's not huge civil enforcement. I mean, it's hard to imagine that there would be criminal enforcement. I mean, there could be, if people, I think it would have to be a fairly egregious type of use or something to get that sort of enforcement. But there are potential criminal and civil penalties under IEPA for violating prohibitions.
So if I have the app or continue to use the app, I could be liable for some of these punitive.
Yes.
Even as an individual.
Yes.
What about?
And
I
was going to say, Monica, it'll go back to how they define transaction, right? And that's the key. What will the Secretary of Commerce say when they finally make their decision about how they're defining the relationships that are subject to the executive order? And that's when we'll know, and we'll have a better understanding and appreciation for how it will impact individuals and companies who use the WeChat or TikTok platforms.
But Justin, it sounds like, traditionally understand commerce, there's always going to be a kind of a rule notification and comment process, right? So there's advance notice. There's sometimes even some consultations and discussions on what the rules should be. But I also understand that under national security, boundaries, they may not need to do that, right? So we may not be given a heads up on what could potentially come up down the pipeline. So again, going back to this question is it going to be different from people versus businesses, or is it just what are some of the recourses, or what do you think could potentially happen? I'm just curious if you think this is something we need to prepare in the short term, medium term, or the long term.
Like you said, I wish I could predict the future and tell you, because I'd be rich as well, right? So one of the things that the executive orders do is they refer back to the May 2019 ICTS executive order, and so that's part of the basis for giving us notice that they have the authority to do this. And then but yes, you're right. I mean, when there's national security rules that are implemented, sometimes they issue an interim final rule, and they'll ask for comments, but it will be active immediately. We've seen that in the context of some CFIUS changes and other rules where the administration has to move quickly to protect what they perceive as a significant national security concern.
So Monica, I think we need to be preparing in the short term, the medium term, and the long term.
I wish I could. I think in the next session, we should call Haipei Shue back onto the panel, because I think this is where we really need some leadership and thought in terms of how do we work through this as a community. And going back, I think Haipei has a letter that is already under works, where he's gathering and creating a coalition of like-minded groups to help start addressing some of these issues. But also, I mean, going back to Brian's earlier point, this is kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? So I think what is really insightful about the presentations and the remarks we've had today is that we're really getting a peer into this larger iceberg that is really there. And WeChat and the TikTok EO, as well as some of these other actions, are really just, the visible parts that we're seeing, but there's this greater undercurrent of this. Some of are calling, the Cold War. Some of are calling the decoupling, right, that is ongoing. And that, like you said, Laura, this is not just something, a one-time ad hoc issue, but that we really need to have a strategy, short-term, medium-term, and long-term, if we want to be able to face and figure out how to deal with this and how to kind of course correct, right, some of these behaviors. I also want to, I know we are segueing into the Q&A segment, and I want to thank the audience members who have emailed me some questions. And please continue to post any questions you have in the chat, and I will do my best to convey them to the speakers. And I apologize that given our limited time today, we won't be able to address everyone's questions. But the goal of the series of this webinar is that, you know, hopefully we can have our experts back, maybe later down the line. And I'm sure there's going to be plenty of developments to discuss. And then also, we might find other platforms too to address some of your questions. And so please keep them coming, and we will do our best. Now, I know that, you know, I think in line with this DOJ initiative that Brian mentioned earlier, that the administration has a very kind of whole of government approach, right, addressing some of the concerns they're seeing in China. One of them is this Clean Network initiative, which is the beginning or kind of driving this purge of Chinese technology companies in the United States. And this is fairly broad, including telecommunication carriers, cloud services, communication cable. So it's not just, you know, software, but also hardware, right? As well as other applications, social media platforms. And I'd like to turn to our three speakers. You know, what advice do you have for companies operating in these areas? You know, not most of us rely on the services, you know, in these areas, but many of us also work for these type of companies. Or a lot of our audience members today, you know, are working in the bilateral space, either through partnerships or other collaborative initiatives in these industries. What is the EO a preview of more barriers to come? And what advice would you give to these companies that, you know, could they be in that target zone? And what should they start thinking about? Maybe I'll start with Brian.
Well, I think the answer is absolutely yes. You know, some of you have heard me say that in this US-China rivalry, we might call it that, whether it's on technology, militarily, or whatever, on so many different levels. One thing is pretty clear to me, at least, that we're living now in an age, and even as we deal with platforms such as TikTok and WeChat, that the battle over technology and supremacy is not going to be over how many warheads you have or satellites you have circling in the sky that have warheads. It's going to be over artificial intelligence, drone technology, all these different forms of technology that, as I said before, will change the way in which we live in. And I think Tom Friedman used to say, whoever gets the next green Google is going to be ahead of the pack. Whatever it is, it's not going to be the kind of supremacy that we lived and saw in the Cold War era and with military weapons, in my view. So whether it's in bio-life science, whether it's in artificial intelligence, this is where the battle will be waged between the countries. And, you know, there's so many different levels to the national security element, because the US government is very, very concerned about the cyber aspects, the hacking and the stealing of technology through means where that doesn't even involve trying to co-opt some scientist who's got a lot of good knowledge in his or her head. It's really just straight out theft through cyber techniques. And that's one element, okay? And then you have the human aspect, which is sort of what we deal with here, I deal with a lot, where live human beings get caught up in this sort of rivalry and competition over this kind of technology. And then you, of course, have what we have, all the political overlay of some of these things where politics comes into play. WeChat, TikTok become part of the political aspects of what's going on between the countries, and maybe it's made part of the trade negotiations and all that between the countries. But you have political connected actions tied to these executive orders, which really have are designed to appeal to whether someone can get elected or not, or whatever. So that's my reaction. That you know, in the coming months, years, in the coming decades, this is where we're headed, and the countries need to really start working together on this and try to draw some lines here. And you know, again, Laura and Justin, you may have some different takes on this from the standpoint of how it operates in Washington, but certainly from where I live, in an enforcement environment, in a litigation environment, in a environment where live human beings who are entrepreneurs, who are scientists, who are just simply working for companies that are in the US-China business space, we're all going to be impacted. We're all going to be impacted by these politics, by this burgeoning rivalry in technology, which again, is not, in my view, focused on the traditional sorts of things we view as national security threats. It's going to be all about technology. So let me turn that back over to Justin and Lauren and maybe get their perspective. But where I live, in an enforcement environment, in a litigation environment, this is going to go on for quite a while.
Yeah, Brian, I think that's right. And Justin and I live in the regulatory environment, and what we're seeing, there's another really big wave of something coming that we haven't really even talked about yet, although Brian has certainly alluded to it in his comments in terms of the technology and the biotech and the AI. And that is the companion legislation that was signed at the same time FIRMA was. It's the Export Control Reform Act of 2018. And the US government, Department of Commerce especially, but there's a committee of a lot of different people working on this, has not really done anything yet, although they just did a few days ago issue an advance notice of proposed rulemaking on the foundational technology piece. But overall, what we're going to see here is that a lot of this technology, very, very new technology, that the US government has not quite caught up yet with in terms of defining the export control requirements, all of that new technology, plus some foundational technology, things that are basic technology that has not been controlled to China or to other countries, is going to become controlled. So a lot of you may be working in an environment, if you're working in tech businesses, where there's going to be, I think, over the next couple of years, some significant increased controls about sending that technology to China or sharing it with Chinese nationals in the United States. And I think this is another significant thing that we're going to see coming, that is just going to increase the tensions here. But it's clear that that's part of the concern about national security, and exactly what Brian's saying. It's not the military might that we thought of in the past, but it's technology and what people are learning and what people are doing and how they're building on those things for AI and for drones and for biotech. There's 14 different categories that they're looking at in terms of the emerging technologies. So I think that's going to be very significant to come in the future. That's going to impact a lot of people's lives.
Yeah, Laura and I, oh, go ahead, Monica. No, I was just going to say, yeah, Laura and I must think about these things the exact same way, because I had written down, you know, companies need to closely monitor changes to U.S. export control rules and regulations. And to build on what Laura said, I think companies need to develop and implement strict export control policies within their companies to ensure that they stay on the right side of the laws and rules. There are many times when we talk with companies who are looking to take investments, and one of the first questions we ask is, how is your technology controlled for export today? And oftentimes they can't answer that question. They've never done the analysis because they've never shipped the technology overseas, or they've just never had taken the time to review that. And so I think it's very important for companies who operate in the technology space, especially, to know and understand how their technology is controlled, and to ensure that they have strict compliance in place so that they don't fall on the wrong side of the regulators and that monitor these issues.
One thing I might add from an enforcement perspective on export control is that in some sectors, the United States government has try to control or restrict the export of technology that may not even be the most advanced or the state-of-the-art technology. Some of the first cases I had involved business people exporting, say, I'll use an example, night vision goggle technology that the US said you needed to get a license to export to certain countries. Come to find out, you could get far more advanced technology of that same kind of product from France or Germany and export it to the same country, China or somewhere, and not have any problem with the US criminal enforcement authorities. So the United States in their own way, trying to restrict the export of technology that even isn't the most advanced, but then you could be subject to civil and criminal sanctions for doing it because they want to control things going out of the United States to places like China.
Yeah, and it sounds like it undermines our ability to compete, as a business or in that industry. Brian, while I feel kind of at the podium, I want to go back to an issue that you raised earlier about this loyalty test, right? And it's interesting because I just feel like what is loyalty and what are the boundaries, right, of national security, and what does that mean, and what's within the scope, what's not within the scope, seems to be ever changing. It's nebulous, and it just creates endless anxiety, right? I have no idea. It's I guess just, off the top of my head, it's really hard for me to know what am I doing and how do I know I'm protecting myself, right? And I have a question in the chat room that kind of flips to that for also not just individuals, but also companies, right? Is that, am I responsible for constantly proving what I'm doing is legal? Or is the burden of proof on the US government, right? So there are two questions. One is, can you talk a little bit about how should an individual, especially, as we are kind of caught between this, very, very treacherous US-China relationship, how should we think about, how do we go about conduct our business and lives in this context of ever-growing national security concerns? And then what about companies? Because it just feels like, is there ever going to be an end to, or is there ever going to be a boundary on what we can and cannot do? Or how do we even determine that, right?
For many people who've heard me talk before, the running joke was, from the enforcement standpoint, if you ever see me again, you're in trouble. That means I gotta have to do some surgery on you, and it's gonna cost you a lot of money, okay? But putting that aside, whether it's for a company and a business or an entrepreneur or just a live human being trying to do his or her work, it's like maintaining your health. It's like go to the Lauras and the Justins of the world and do the self-diagnostic. Find out if you're in compliance, if you're running a business that's exporting or looking to sell goods or something to China or somewhere else, all right? You can do preventive maintenance. This is my medical analogy that many of you have heard me preach. If you want to stay healthy, get your checkup, because you're in an environment where you can get pretty darn sick, okay, if you're not careful. Now, I know these analogies sound a little quaint and all that, but they have some practical application here. You don't ever want to see an enforcement folks or litigator like me, and you can do it if you take the kind of preventive steps, get the proper advice, whether it's on CFIUS or traversing through the export regulations, to make sure that you're complying or going to the right people to get the right licenses. You can do it and avoid these kind of problems if you take those kind of preventive steps. That's what I preach in every one of these seminars, okay? And irrespective of loyalty and all that stuff, which is a whole different thing about whether or not you might get singled out for investigation or prosecution. But in terms of your day-to-day life, whether you're working in a business or operating a business, you can take steps to avoid stepping on the landmine if you go and do the checkup, like you would at any doctor for a physical. That's my advice.
Thank you. And then I also have two questions for Laura and Justin. And they're a little bit ad hoc because I'm just going through the questions. We have a question about CFIUS and some of these, increased scrutiny of these foreign type of investment and partnership deals. Are you safe if you're outside of the U.S.-China zone? So if I'm operating it, so the question is the administration targeting just U.S. and China? And if I have a business dealing with that's outside of that lane, then am I relatively okay? Or am I still subject to some of these regulations? Would like to have you comment on that. And then we also have a second question that is a little more tailored to, I think, the penalties and prohibitions question we had asked earlier. And the question is, can you give an example and help us think through a company like Apple, for example? Could they continue to carry the WeChat app in China? Would they have to take it out of the app store globally? And what are some of the implications for a company like that? And I'll leave it to you, Laura and Justin, to answer those two questions, please.
Okay, I'll start with the Apple one first. As Justin mentioned before, we don't know exactly how they're going to define transactions, but I would expect that it will be defined broadly enough that Apple will no longer be able to keep it in its app store in China. I think that certainly will fall within what will probably be prohibited if this whole exercise does go forward. And on the first question about CFIUS, all foreign investors are subject to CFIUS review. I think it is well known among CFIUS practitioners that FIRMA was somewhat directed at Chinese investment in particular, the concerns that there needed to be stronger authorities to review certain transactions. And when we advise clients who are looking at transactions that are subject to CFIUS review, it's definitely true that there's a spectrum of foreign investors, some who are more risky and others who are less risky. So we typically tend to put China and Russia in the more risky spectrum. And then, for example, other Asian countries in the Middle East, and then Western Europe is very less risky. And then in the new law, it's even possible for Canadian and UK and Australian investors to be accepted. So some countries have a much easier task in going before CFIUS, but all foreign acquisitions are subject to potential review.
Yeah, and to add on that, for each transaction that the committee reviews, they do a vulnerability assessment to determine whether or not the transaction threatens national security. They look at the country and the individual investors from a threat perspective. They look at the vulnerabilities associated with each U.S. business that's a target of foreign investment to determine if there's concerns, and then they assess whether there's any consequences to U.S. national security. That's done for each transaction as they review it through their processes. And you could have an investor from a high threat country, but they may be purchasing something that's very benign, and then there wouldn't be any significant consequences. And so those transactions, and we're still seeing some of those get through today, do go through the committee and receive clearance. On the other hand, in my experience with the committee, we had very benign investors, but they were investing in some very sensitive technology. And so the committee may request certain mitigation agreements with those investors to ensure that the companies operate in a way that's consistent with the goals of U.S. national security. And the committee has a lot of resources in its playbook to be able to determine how to best assess whether or not a transaction raises concerns. If they can mitigate it, they can, and if they can't, then they have to refer that matter to the president, who ultimately has the authority to prohibit or order a divestiture of a closed transaction.
I also want to just reiterate, we had earlier in the discussion talked a little about, if there was a ban and you still have the app on your phone, right? And I think this is a question of not just whether you're in the United States, but extraterritoriality, right? So if I have my old phone, and I go to China, and I'm a US citizen, am I going to be liable under the IEEPA penalties if I were using WeChat in China? Right, because we had talked about there are penalties associated with IEEPA, but if I'm not within the territory of the United States, can I still use that app, or would I come back to the United States and then be penalized?
If you're under IEPA, the restrictions apply to all US persons wherever they are in the world. If you are a US person, you are a US citizen or a US green card holder, generally speaking, under IEPA, you're a US person. And so those restrictions apply to you wherever you are in the world. They also apply to any non-US person who is in US territory. So those are the jurisdictional hooks. So if you're in US territory, even if you're a non-US person, and this is similar for those of you who might be familiar with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, for example. If you're a non-US person and you come into US territory and you do something in furtherance of bribing a foreign government official, the US government has jurisdiction over those activities. So it's similar under IEPA.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. That's really important. There's also a question about Facebook, right? So some of us have seen the article that, especially in the case of TikTok, that this is a very innovative company, right? That rarely, it's the first where they've really refined their platform, their algorithm, and have done a great job kind of capturing and serving as a social media app for a lot of children and a lot of entertainers, right? And I think for the first time, we're seeing these very innovative Chinese companies outcompeting their competitors in the United States, like Facebook. And so the question is, are we seeing some of this targeting because the fact that some folks are concerned about this competition, this wave that is coming, right? Certainly TikTok is not the first one. I think more and more we're going to see very successful Chinese companies looking to expand and grow in the US market. So if to the extent that we have Chinese company participants or owners or investors, right? A lot of these Chinese companies have US investors. What is your advice to them? Are they in the line of fire, especially under this clean network or whatever national security or other types of, trusted or untrusted concerns? Do you think, again, the question is it just national security or are we really looking at a degree of this battle over dominance, right, in the internet and communication technology industry? Maybe Laura, since you're, I have you on the platform, maybe we'll start with you and then certainly welcome thoughts from Brian and Justin as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think there's been speculation that part of the reason for the TikTok executive order has to do with some concern about what happened with this big rally that President Trump was supposed to have in Houston, so who knows whether there's some other, driving forces here. I will say though, that I do think that as I discussed a little bit in sort of how did we get here, this idea of personal data about US citizens has been growing. I mean, that isn't a new thing. And so I think it is more grounded and rooted in that there is concern that foreign countries and foreign governments are having access to large amounts of personal data about US citizens. And so we've seen it in the other types of examples that I explained. I mean, this is not the first time. It's the first time IEPA has been used, but it's not the first time that there's been significant executive action taken related to foreign country investment in US businesses that allow access to significant amounts of US personal data. And I think that's what this is really about.
Okay. Brian or Justin, is there anything you'd like to add?
I just want to add briefly, going back to my earlier mantra, this is not going to end with a change of administrations. There is this deep-seated, growing concern about access to data that Laura and Justin have talked about, that is shared by both sides of the aisle. I think perhaps in a change of administration, you might have less of the rhetoric and some of the political motivations that you see that underlie some of what we see in the news here, or the singling out of particular companies. But this issue is not going away, and is one that the U.S. government is going to be grappling with as the technology rivalry continues. And, but so that national security element will still be there no matter what. I do believe and hope that there'll be a reduction of some of, not just the rhetoric, but some of the, hopefully, a change in some of the priorities of the Department of Justice on targeting, say, Chinese American professors and things like that, if there is a change of administrations, and a shift more towards educational awareness rather than actual prosecutions. But again, it's hard to predict these things, but this is not going away. And that's one of my big things that I want to make sure people know and that we have to stay focused on.
Justin, you're muted.
I think Laura and Brian summed it up pretty nice.
Great.
I think that it's not going to go away, and I agree with Laura that these are primarily national security concerns. It's how you define national security, I think, it has evolved and will probably continue to evolve going forward.
Great. My final question is to Brian for the Q&A session. And this is kind of the $1 million question, which I think, and I want to flag this for Haipei as well. We have some audience members asking, Brian, what is your advice to a group like UCA? Right? You had earlier said that there needs to be mobilization. There needs to be, I think there needs to be leadership. There needs to be a plan, right? As you said, this is not going away. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more going on here than we could even cover today in our session. What is your advice to the community and to a group like UCA? And what do you think are some of the things that we should consider and think about for the community?
Well, it's twofold. One is we need to get better organized. We could do a whole lot better in that regard by way of forming the kind of coalitions that Haipei was talking about that really underlie UCA. We need to get, the legal services organizations, whether they are Asian Americans Advancing Justice and NAPABA and groups like that, to work with the community organizations like UCA, OCA, Committee 100, whatever. And then we also need to do, on the second prong, we need to reach out to the non-Asian groups, whether it's the professional organization like the National Academy of Engineers or whatever, ACLU, whatever the groups are that have a common interest with some of our concerns. And we need to do a better job of forming coalitions with those non-Asian, non-Chinese groups. And then we need to do better at messaging, even through social media and platforms. And then we need the leadership, because I often joke that we don't have the kinds of historical folks that maybe other ethnic groups have had in this country. And if I want to name names, Cesar Chavez on one end, Martin Luther King on another. We haven't had those kinds of people in our history, even though we've been in the United States for over 150 years. And we need to step up and have leadership and people who will be willing to speak out, whether it's on these social media platforms that are now available, or you find other forms of communication, YouTube and the like, where our messaging can get out there and we're people who are willing to step up and be vocal about it and articulate about it, whether it's the Andrew Yangs of the world who get in the news because they run for president, or some of our top business leaders who are household names, and I won't mention them because we know who they are. But we need to do better and get organized and get out there and speak up, because if we don't, history will repeat itself, and our cause, and for not only ourselves, but our progeny, our children and our grandchildren are going to still face some of these same problems and obstacles that we have had in assimilating in U.S. society because of a perceived threat from a national security level because of China. And you're going to hear Chinese Communist Party 1 million times between now and the election, okay? And the fact that we look different. The general Asian Pacific American challenge of looking different and suffering discrimination because of just the fact we look different. So we got to step up and be conscious of that and get organized and make more noise and step up. So that's my message, and I keep repeating it in all these seminars, but they're webinars, but I got to preach it again here.
We will keep augmenting that message as well, because at the end of the day, that ability to speak up and share your thoughts and express yourself is the fundamental democratic value, right? That makes this country such a great place to be. For the final few minutes, I want to give the platform over to Haipei Shue, president of United Chinese Americans. So he can have a few words in terms of the next steps. But before I do that, I just want to highlight two things. Once again, this is the first of a series of webinars that we would like to host as part of UCA's advocacy and outreach initiative. So we look forward to your input on other topics. I do think we have a couple more webinars planned on the executive order for WeChat and TikTok. You know, as we've learned today, there is just so much at play here, right? And so we have really barely scratched the surface. And we hope that at some point our speakers will join us down the line. And again, and we can pick their brains and get their insights again, because I think this is a long-term continued conversation to have. And then the second point before I turn it over to Haipei is, again, going back to the need for participation and for engagement is, you know, I want to make a plug for your support for UCA, because honestly, this is a group that functions on the dedication of volunteers, the support of funders and members. And without your support, honestly, you know, Haipei is a one-man team and we have to support him. I just want to say that we are here to support Haipei. We're here to push forward the messaging, and that we do this as a group. And for UCA to help you, I hope you will also be able to help UCA. So with that in mind, let's turn over to Haipei Shue, our president. And and thank you, Haipei. Thank you again for giving us this platform. And please go ahead with your closing remarks. Thank you.
All right, Monica, thank you for being a wonderful moderator. Isn't she great? I'm very grateful for what you have done for this evening. Again, we just had a wonderful time with Brian, Laura, and Justin. And as we have expected from June State lawyers, they are starting lawyer, and I really enjoyed their analysis and expertise on this. And I really hope that you guys can come back again when we need you again. As Brian said, this is going to be for the long haul, and we will have plenty of opportunity down the road on that issues. Now, just to let you know quickly that UCA has taken a position not agreeing with this presidential executive order on multiple grounds. Primarily, we think that this executive order will have a disparate impact on the Chinese American communities, especially with our limited choice of connecting with our friends, relatives, colleagues in China. And second, of course, is that this executive order is likely have violated or put restrictions on the freedom of speech, our treasured constitutional protection. We are against any limit and a restriction on freedom of speech, whether that's in China, Middle East, and our own countries. So this is our country, and we are fighting our own fight here. We have a big task before us, and we think that we cannot do it alone. So I want to appeal to you, please join us. We know that you care and you are as concerned as we are about these issues, but it's just too big a task for UCA to do that alone. And so if you can, in any way, any manner, join us. Our website is ucausa.org, and we will be there fighting with you, and we will organize, we will mobilize, and we will fight until the day that Chinese Americans are treated fairly, equally as a full citizen of this country. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Haipei. And once again, thank you to our speakers, Brian Sun, Laura Fraedrich, and Justin Huff from Jones Day. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening. And good morning for those overseas.